Worst case doesn't mean a Hollywood collapse or some dramatic moment where the map redraws overnight. It means the war doesn't end soon, losses keep demanding fresh people, and the revenue side shrinks while the spending side swells slowly at first. Then all at once, it means sanctions stop being a list on paper and start becoming enforcement. Insurers hesitate, ports ask harder questions, middlemen disappear, and each workaround costs more than the last one. I'm not saying Russia is about to break. I'm saying Russia is positioning itself to absorb a longer punch than most viewers think. Empires don't usually fall from a single hit, they fall when the body gets tired of healing. Look at the rhythm of attacks and ignore the commentary for a second. When negotiations look distant, the logic of war shifts from win today to shape tomorrow, and that's when infrastructure becomes a bargaining chip instead of a battlefield. Target, power stations, substations, heating networks, things civilians touch every hour are not just steel and cables. They're political oxygen. Turn that oxygen down, and you raise the social cost of continuing. You test the air defense net, you measure repair capacity, you measure morale. It's a pressure campaign designed to manufacture leverage, and leverage is what you bring to a table when you don't trust the other side to offer you one. This is the part that sounds cynical until you remember how states behave under strain. A long war teaches a government a cruel lesson. Battlefield gains can be reversible, but exhaustion sticks. So the strikes don't need to be decisive. They need to be repetitive, predictable, and just expensive enough to keep society paying attention. Two things happen at once: the defender burns missiles and radar hours, and the public learns to live with interruptions, then starts asking who can end them. That's why a surge in long-range attacks can be perfectly consistent with preparing for talks, because the goal isn't only destruction, it's conditioning. And notice the quietness around it. The messaging is often calmer than the action, as if the system is trying not to spook its own audience while it tightens screws elsewhere. That's a familiar pattern when leaders expect pain. They try to spread it out, rename it, normalize it, anything to keep the room from panicking. If you're following this conflict online, do one simple, lawful thing: verify claims with multiple reputable sources before sharing, and avoid targeting private individuals' information warfare feeds on careless clicks. Underneath the noise, the real question is not whether Russia can strike, but whether it can keep striking at this tempo without breaking the other two pillars, because missiles are only one kind of expenditure. The more decisive burn rate is human and financial, and those ledgers don't care about ideology. Here's the darker mirror. The more a country anticipates stalemate, the more it invests in pain as a language. Pain is simple and legible, and it travels faster than diplomacy, but it also has a price tag that reveals whether this is desperation or a deliberate long game. Stocks of missiles don't refill by rhetoric. They refill by factories, by imports, by cash, by time, and by a workforce that isn't already stretched thin. So when you see precision weapons used in routine cycles, you're watching a financial decision disguised as a military one. That decision only makes sense if someone believes the replenishment machine will keep running, and the moment that machine coughs, the state starts improvising with the one resource it can still commandeer. Every prolonged campaign becomes a triangle: pressure on the front, pressure on the population, pressure on the treasury, each corner pulling at the others. You can fake one corner for a while, print slogans, cut corners, reshuffle commanders, but the triangle still demands balance. So when you see the strikes intensify, don't just ask what they hit. Ask what they're buying and what they're preparing to spend next, because the hardest part of a long war isn't firing the first shot, it's paying for the 1,000th week after week while pretending it's normal. And the next sign, the one that reveals whether this is sustainable, shows up where governments hate looking: the pipeline of bodies. Because a long war doesn't just burn fuel and steel, it burns people, and people are the one resource you can't manufacture on a deadline. A big, loud mobilization is efficient on paper, but it's politically radioactive in real life. It triggers flights, protests, and a kind of quiet sabotage where families simply stop cooperating. That's why the most revealing preparations aren't the ones you see on state TV. They're the ones you feel in everyday incentives, like a labor market that suddenly starts bidding like a desperate employer. Then the billboards change, the recruiters stop acting like patriots and start acting like salesmen, and the state pretends nothing special is happening. You can almost hear the shift when talk of duty gets replaced by talk of compensation, paperwork, and deadlines. When a government expects a short war, it drafts. When it expects an endless war, it starts buying. And buying manpower has a signature cash up front, contracts with fine print, and a recruitment machine that can be scaled without admitting there's a crisis. Instead of a single national call-up, you get a rolling churn, regional quotas, local offices competing for bodies, and advertisements that sell war like a stable job with benefits. The pitch changes depending on who's listening: adventure for the young, debt relief for the desperate, status for the lonely, a paycheck for anyone who has run out of options. The point isn't only numbers. It's control, because contracts let the state choose timing, training, and rotation in ways a chaotic draft doesn't, and it keeps the temperature down at home because volunteers are easier to explain than conscripts. That's the quiet preparation most viewers miss. It's mobilization with a customer service smile. Of course, contracts alone don't fill the gaps fast enough, so the pipeline widens in darker ways. Prison recruitment turns sentences into bargaining chips, and the message is brutal: risk the front or rot where you are. Foreigners and migrants become another lever, pulled through promises of papers, payments, or protection for families who can't say no. Even within Russia, the burden doesn't spread evenly. It concentrates where economic pain is already normal, where a bonus looks like salvation rather than bait. None of this is about ideology at the individual level, it's about survival math. The state isn't just searching for fighters. It's searching for people whose exit won't shake the center. And that's the counterintuitive part: the more voluntary the system looks, the more it signals stress, because paying for obedience is expensive. Money becomes a filter that replaces coercion. Pay enough, and you can avoid the scenes that make a capital city nervous. It also lets the Kremlin manage quality, at least in theory, because a contract can be renewed, extended, or quietly replaced without an announcement that spooks the market. Think of it like a subscription model for force. You don't need one dramatic surge if you can keep the monthly churn steady. But subscriptions only work while the payments clear, and war payments aren't a side expense. They are the engine. Once you accept that, the manpower story stops being a military story and turns into a fiscal story. Every bonus, every compensation payment, every new factory shift is a line item, and line items add up faster than propaganda can. If you want to see worst-case preparation, watch whether the state keeps raising offers and expanding eligibility, because that tells you it's choosing money over coercion, at least for now. Before you repost casualty figures or draft rumors, check at least 2 major outlets, blur personal data, and remember, misinformation can endanger real people on both sides. The uncomfortable truth is that this approach can keep the war going longer precisely because it spreads the pain into payments instead of panic. It's the same logic as any household in trouble. First you dip into savings, then you borrow, then you start cutting essentials, and that sets up the next squeeze, because when revenue tightens, the first thing that breaks isn't the narrative, it's the cash flow. This is why the budget matters more than the battlefield map, and why sanctions enforcement is not a background detail. It's a timer. If the state can sell oil, move money, and insure ships, it can keep buying soldiers and missiles, even if it's paying a premium every step of the way. But when the workarounds get riskier, the premium turns into a penalty, and penalties compound until they start forcing choices: cut civilian spending, print more, or quietly raid whatever reserves still exist. That's where quiet preparation becomes frantic improvisation, because the same system that can recruit discreetly can also bleed discreetly. The next part is about that bleed: how the war is financed, how the bypass routes are getting squeezed, and why one shipping decision can echo all the way to the front. Now follow the money. Because money is where governments stop acting brave and start acting honest. Russia can talk about momentum, but the budget has to pay for momentum every day. Energy still matters, yet the share of oil and gas revenue in the federal budget has slid far from 2022 highs. That sounds like diversification until you notice what replaced it: heavier taxes, one-off fixes, and more borrowing at home. A deficit isn't a headline. It's a stress test, repeated monthly, until something snaps, and the Kremlin is already writing its next year as if the war bill doesn't get smaller. To keep the machine running, a state has only a few levers: drain reserves, raise revenue, cut civilians, borrow, or print. Russia has been pulling several at once, which is what you do when you expect the pain to last. Says read of Russia's 2026 budget points to another deficit year, even with optimistic assumptions and a tilt toward security spending. You can hear the logic between the lines: keep funding the essentials, delay the rest, and let inflation do some of the dirty work. That's not collapse. It's adaptation, the kind that looks stable right up until it becomes brittle. Worst case isn't a single bankruptcy, it's the moment every solution costs more than the problem. Now zoom in on the revenue artery. Russian crude has to travel, get insured, get paid for, and arrive without drama. The price cap coalition built a trap in late 2022. Services tied to a ceiling price, and the whole system works only when it is enforced. In 2025, the EU's 17th sanctions package targeted a record number of vessels linked to this trade, and the UK listed more too. France even boarded a suspected shadow fleet ship recently, which is a message you can read without translation. The point isn't to stop every barrel. It's to make every barrel riskier, slower, and less profitable. When shipping becomes a gamble, the budget starts paying interest on uncertainty. That's where the shadow fleet matters, not as a spy story, but as a spreadsheet. Old tankers, opaque ownership, and patchwork services can move oil, but they do it with friction. Friction means higher freight, higher discounts, and more money left on the table before taxes even touch it. The Financial Times reported that discounts for Urals widened sharply in 2025, squeezing revenues even as spending stayed high. Markets don't need to punish you with anger. They punish you by refusing to subsidize your fantasies. And once the discount becomes normal, the war becomes more expensive than it looks on paper. Put it together and the quiet preparation stops being mysterious, it becomes pattern recognition. Pressure is the first signal. Strikes that test air defenses and raise the civilian price of endurance. People is the second. Mobilization without the word manpower purchased in installments. Money is the third. Budgets written for deficits. Priorities shifted toward survival, not comfort. Bypass routes are the fourth. Shipping networks kept alive even as enforcement tightens around them. A country can lose battles and still look powerful, but lose credibility as an enforcer and the whole brand decays. So what does the next 6 months look like if this worst-case mindset is real? One track is the grind, steady strikes, slow advances, recruitment bonuses creeping upward, and a budget that bleeds but doesn't break. Another is the freeze, a colder line on the map, an information war, and negotiations that stall while both sides rearm. The third is the cornered animal, more asymmetric pressure, cyber, sabotage accusations. Energy signaling because direct gains get too costly. Watch the tempo of long-range attacks, recruitment offers, deficit data, and how often tankers get named or seized. If those indicators all worsen together, you won't need a dramatic announcement to know the plan is endurance. There's a reason this matters beyond numbers, because endurance is what authoritarian systems sell as destiny. Ukraine's resistance has already forced Russia to spend more, recruit more, and hide more, and that ripple hits every would-be strongman watching. Alliances built on fear look solid until the patron can't pay the premiums, and then the phone calls get shorter. That's why sanctions enforcement and budget stress aren't technicalities. They're the language of limits. Freedom doesn't always win fast, but it wins by making tyranny expensive, and that's exactly what this war is doing. The silver lining is uncomfortable, yet real. Every month Ukraine holds, the authoritarian network pays compound interest. If you want to track this like an analyst, pick one metric and follow it: weekly deficit prints, Urals discounts, or recruitment offers. Drop in the comments which indicator you think will break first, the people pipeline, the money pipeline, or the bypass routes. And if you want a part 2, I'll map the specific signs that Russia is shifting from paid churn to real, society-shaking mobilization.